Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The Watcher on the Stairs. The house had been in my family for decades, its history stretching back to when my great-grandparents first settled in the area. It was large and imposing, with peeling paint on the exterior and narrow, creaking staircases inside. After my divorce, I needed somewhere affordable to stay, and the house, though aging and isolated, seemed like a practical choice. It was nestled on a quiet hill, surrounded by dense trees that gave it an almost otherworldly quality. My aunt, who had lived there for most of her life, had moved to a care facility a few years prior. "You can stay as long as you need," she had told me, "but don't forget to keep the stairs swept." I thought it was a strange comment, but I didn't ask her to explain. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning and unpacking, and my evenings settling into the rhythm of living alone in such a large house. The quiet was both comforting and eerie, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a thunderclap. It started on the fourth night. I was lying in bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I was just about to drift off when I heard it, a faint creak from the staircase. At first I dismissed it as the house settling. The place was old, after all, and the wood groaned constantly. But then it happened again. This time it was distinct. 2 deliberate creaks, like someone stepping slowly up the stairs. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, listening intently. The sound stopped, leaving the house in heavy silence. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Grabbing the flashlight from my nightstand, I tiptoed out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The staircase loomed at the far end, the dim moonlight filtering through the stained glass window above it. I aimed the flashlight down the stairs. Nothing. The wooden steps stretched into the darkness below, empty and still. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the house playing tricks on me. But as I turned to head back to bed, I heard it again. A single, deliberate creak, this time from the top step. My heart raced as I shone the flashlight directly at the top of the stairs. There was no one there. I barely slept that night, every little sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just my imagination, a combination of exhaustion and nerves from being alone in such an old house. I even laughed at myself as I swept the stairs that afternoon, the rhythmic swish of the broom almost soothing. But the creaking continued, always at night, always slow and deliberate. Sometimes it came from the middle of the staircase, other times from the very top. I started to dread going to bed, my nerves fraying with each passing day. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to set up my phone to record the staircase. I placed it on a small table in the hallway, the camera pointed directly at the stairs, and hit record. Then I went to bed, leaving the phone to capture whatever was causing the noise. The next morning, I retrieved the phone, my stomach churning with equal parts fear and anticipation. I fast-forwarded through the footage, watching the empty staircase bathed in moonlight. Hours passed with nothing unusual, just the faint sounds of the house settling. And then, at 3:12 a.m., the creaking started. My blood ran cold as I watched the screen. A shadow appeared at the bottom of the stairs, faint and shifting, like smoke curling in the air. It moved slowly upward, pausing on each step as the wood groaned under its invisible weight. By the time it reached the top of the stairs, the shadow had taken a vaguely humanoid shape, thin and angular, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It stopped at the top step, turning toward the camera. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Eyes? A face? The screen blurred as the shadow leaned closer, filling the frame with darkness. The recording ended abruptly. I packed my things that same day, leaving the house and its creaking stairs behind. My aunt called a few weeks later, asking why I'd left so suddenly. When I told her about the noises and the shadow, she sighed heavily. "I told you to keep the stairs swept," she said. "They don't like it when you forget." The face in the lake. When I was 13, my parents rented a lakeside cabin for the summer. It wasn't the kind of vacation I wanted. No Wi-Fi, no TV, and the nearest town was half an hour away. But my parents were determined to have a family bonding experience, so my protests were ignored. The cabin itself was quaint but old, with creaky wooden floors and windows that stuck when you tried to open them. Behind the house, a small dock extended into the lake, its weathered boards warped from years of sun and rain. The lake was massive, its dark water stretching out toward the horizon, surrounded by dense pine trees. There was only one other cabin on the far side, barely visible through the mist that lingered in the mornings. My dad assured me we'd have plenty to do: fishing, swimming, kayaking. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had as I stared out at the water. It was too still, too dark. The kind of lake that seemed to swallow everything whole. The first week was uneventful. My younger brother and I spent our days exploring the woods while my parents lounged on the porch, reading. At night, the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional splash of something breaking the water's surface. Then, on the 8th night, I saw it. I had woken up around midnight, thirsty from the day's hike. I tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake my family, and grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen. As I stood at the sink, sipping and staring out the window, something caught my eye, a faint ripple in the lake, just beyond the dock. At first, I thought it was a fish, or maybe a bird diving into the water. But then I saw it. A face, pale and ghostly, just beneath the surface. Its eyes were wide open, staring directly at me, unblinking. I froze, the glass slipping from my hand and shattering in the sink. When I looked again, the face was gone. The water was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had been there at all. I barely slept that night. The image of the face burned into my mind, its hollow eyes and slack features haunting me every time I closed my eyes. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the moonlight, a reflection distorted by the rippling water. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen. My dad chuckled, ruffling my hair. "Probably a fish," he said dismissively. My mom was more sympathetic, but chalked it up to my imagination. "The lake can play tricks on you," she said, her voice soft but firm. That day, I avoided the dock, sticking close to the cabin while my brother and dad fished. I watched from the porch as they cast their lines, laughing and joking, completely unaware of the dark, foreboding feeling that gripped me every time I glanced at the water. That night, the face returned. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the dock. I sat up, my heart racing as I listened. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the quiet night. I crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the lake. The moonlight illuminated the water, its surface shimmering like black glass. And there, at the end of the dock, stood a figure. It was pale, almost translucent, its long hair dripping with water. Its head was tilted upward, as if it were looking directly at my window. I couldn't make out its features, but I didn't need to. I knew it was the same face I had seen in the water. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, pulling the curtain shut. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but fear kept me frozen. I stood there trembling as the tapping started again, this time on the window. I don't remember how long I stayed there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually the tapping stopped, and the night grew quiet once more. When I finally found the courage to peek out the window, the dock was empty. The next morning, I begged my parents to leave. My dad rolled his eyes, annoyed, but my mom seemed concerned. She agreed that we could cut the trip short, and by that afternoon, we were packed and on the road. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lake one last time. The water was still, shimmering in the midday sun. But just before we rounded the bend, I saw it again, floating just beneath the surface, watching us leave. The room that wasn't there. The apartment building wasn't anything special, just another aging brick structure in the heart of the city. I found the listing online, and the rent was surprisingly cheap for the area. The landlord, a wiry man in his late 50s, seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys. "It's a great place," he said, smiling nervously. "Quiet. Perfect for someone like you." I didn't think much of his tone at the time. I was desperate for a place to stay, and the apartment had everything I needed. It was a modest one-bedroom, with large windows that overlooked the busy street below, and a kitchen that was just big enough to cook in. The walls were a little dingy. The floors creaked, and the paint peeled in some corners. But I didn't mind. It felt like home. The layout was straightforward. The kitchen, living room, bathroom, and bedroom were all connected by a short hallway. It wasn't until my second week there that I noticed something strange. It was late, and I had just come back from work. As I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks. There was a door at the end of the hall that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I walked closer, running my fingers over the wooden frame. It was identical to the other doors in the apartment, complete with a brass knob that gleamed faintly under the dim hallway light. I tried the knob, but it was locked. Confused, I called the landlord the next morning. "Hey," I said hesitantly, "did you guys do some kind of renovation? There's a new door in my hallway." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. "There shouldn't be a door there." "Well, there is now," I said. "It's locked, though." "Don't touch it," he said quickly, his tone sharp. "It's probably nothing. Just leave it alone." His answer didn't sit right with me, but I let it go for the time being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease every time I walked past the door. It was like it didn't belong there, a foreign object grafted onto my otherwise ordinary apartment. A few nights later, I was woken by a sound. It was faint at first, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the door. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, making my way cautiously down the hallway, The tapping stopped as I approached, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I reached out and touched the doorknob. It was cold, unnaturally so, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I yanked my hand back, a shiver running down my spine. The door felt wrong, as if it were alive somehow, its presence pressing against me. The next day I bought a screwdriver and decided to force it open. I couldn't take the not knowing. If the landlord wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I'd find out for myself. When I removed the lock, the door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing. The room was empty. The walls were bare, the floor dusty. It was small, barely big enough to fit a bed, and it smelled faintly of damp wood and decay. In the far corner, there was a single chair, old and wooden, facing the wall. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air felt colder here, heavier. I crouched down to inspect the chair, noticing faint scratches etched into the wall in front of it. They formed words written haphazardly, as if someone had carved them in a frenzy. "Let me out!" I stumbled back, my breath hitching as the room seemed to grow darker. The door behind me slammed shut, and the temperature dropped sharply. I spun around, pounding on the door, screaming for someone, anyone, to help. Then, just as suddenly, the door swung open. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The door closed behind me, and when I turned back, the lock was back in place, as if I'd never removed it. I left the apartment the next day, breaking the lease and losing my deposit. I couldn't stay there. Not with that room, whatever it was, still lurking in the hallway. I've moved on since then, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that door. I wonder if someone else has opened it, if they've seen what I saw, or worse, if they've let something out. The smiling man. It was nearly 2 a.m., and I was walking home from a late shift at the diner. The streets were unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too intentional. Streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, their pale orange glow casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. The cool night air brushed against my skin, making me pull my jacket tighter around me. The route home wasn't long, just 15 minutes through mostly residential streets. But at night, it always felt a little eerie. I kept my head down, focusing on the sound of my boots clicking against the sidewalk, when I noticed him. He was standing across the street, under the flickering light of a lamppost. At first, I thought he was just another late-night wanderer, someone taking a shortcut or heading home like me. But something about the way he stood caught my attention. He was too still, his lanky frame rigid, his arms hanging unnaturally at his sides. He was tall, wearing a suit that seemed too big for him, the fabric hanging loosely off his thin shoulders. And then there was his face. Even from across the street, I could see his smile, a wide, toothy grin that stretched too far, like it was carved into his face. His head was tilted at an odd angle, as though he were studying me. I kept walking, forcing myself not to look at him again. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move. His long legs carried him forward, slowly at first, matching my pace from the other side of the street. I quickened my steps, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him. The houses here were dark, their windows blank and lifeless, and the air felt heavier, colder. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. He was still there. But now, He was on my side of the street. He wasn't running, wasn't even walking quickly. He moved with a strange, deliberate rhythm, each step long and fluid, as though he were gliding. His head remained tilted, that grotesque grin never wavering. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. I felt a surge of panic and broke into a run, my boots slamming against the pavement as I sprinted down the street. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from him. When I reached the corner, I risked a glance back. He was gone. I stopped, gasping for air, my hands on my knees as I tried to calm my racing heart. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe he was just some harmless weirdo and I'd overreacted. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned sharply, and there he was, standing in the middle of the street. His grin was wider now, his teeth gleaming in the faint light. He raised one long arm, pointing directly at me. "Stop!" I shouted, backing away. "Stay the hell away from me!" He didn't stop. He began to walk again, his movements smooth and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. My breath hitched as I turned and ran, weaving through side streets and alleys, my legs burning with the effort. I could hear his footsteps, always at the same steady pace no matter how fast I ran. I burst onto a main road, my eyes darting around for help. There was no one, no cars, no pedestrians, just the hollow emptiness of the city at night. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the darkness. I ran toward it, practically throwing myself through the glass doors. The cashier looked up from his magazine, startled. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. There's someone following me," I panted, clutching the counter for support. "He's outside." The cashier nodded slowly, stepping around the counter to peer through the glass doors. "I don't see anyone," he said, his tone skeptical. I turned, my heart sinking. The street outside was empty. The smiling man was gone. "Maybe you're just tired," the cashier said, offering a half smile. "Long night, huh?" I nodded weakly, too shaken to argue. I stayed in the gas station for nearly an hour, waiting until I felt brave enough to head home. When I finally stepped outside, the street was quiet. The walk back to my apartment was uneventful, though every shadow seemed to twist into his shape, and every sound made me flinch. I thought I was safe, but when I reached my building, I froze. He was there, standing under the streetlight across the road. His head was tilted farther now, almost upside down, and his grin seemed impossibly wide. He didn't follow me this time. He just stood there, watching as I hurried inside and locked the door. I haven't seen him since that night, but I know he's still out there. Sometimes when I'm alone, I feel like I'm being watched, and when I look out the window, I half expect to see him, standing under a flickering light, still smiling,